Just one more minute to see if other people join. We have like 27. So. So let's get started and welcome to the 7th CEM Dialogue. This session is coordinated by Ian Convery and Steve Carver, co-chairs of the CEM Rewilding Thematic Group. The Rewilding Task Force was established in 2017 and in 2019 became a thematic group due to the amount of work and the leadership of both Ian and Steve and the full core group of Rewilding. So the group has done an outstanding job developing a set of draft guiding principles which have been tested in several workshops between 2019 and 2020, together with several publications and papers presenting all this outstanding work. So in this session, this group will be introducing the rewilding theory and practice and some other topics that will be addressed by the co-chairs of our thematic group. So over to you, Ian. It's a pleasure to have you all in this CEM event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. I think we're probably still the newest CEM thematic group. So what we'd like to do today is really introduce our core group and also talk about some of our current work and our future work plans as well. Next slide, please, Steve. We're going to talk around a range of issues, as Angela has already kind of introduced. I'm going to start by talking about what rewilding isn't before we then talk about what rewilding is. I'll introduce the group, though Angela's done much of that for me already. Thank you. Sally will talk about rewilding history. Steve will introduce the principles. Adam will talk to the legal context from rewilding. And we'll have some notes from the field with some case study material from Rene and Zoltan and Erwin. And then we'll wrap it up with summary and next steps and future work plans for the group. Next slide, thank you. We've got a number of publications, mainly focusing on the guiding principles, which are currently out or about to come out, including this paper in conservation biology, which of course has a number of CEM members as co-authors on this, and a forthcoming ISCN briefing note as well. If you want to skip on, Steve, it just goes through the rest of the papers. We've got a piece in the Conversation, and Steve and I wrote something in British Wildlife on rewilding as well. So there's a bunch of publications, many of which are available from the RTG website. And I think before talking about what rewilding is, it's perhaps useful just to consider what rewilding isn't. It certainly isn't about looking backwards and trying to recreate an environment for 5, 10, or perhaps 15,000 years ago. But reference ecosystems are important in terms of informing kind of future planning, but it's very much a forward-looking approach. It isn't kind of conservation fundamentalism. It's not something that's hell-bent on rewilding everywhere. We need to rewild, but we also still need to provide food and important commodities like timber. So compatible land use is the key here, an integrated approach. It's not anti-farming or anti-people or anti-human for that matter. It's very much about rewilding ourselves too, and developing and creating a new and more positive relationship with nature and with the natural world. It's often thought that rewilding is only about bringing back predators such as wolves and bear. And while species reintroductions can be an important rewilding tool, and apex predators in particular can be very important, this has absolutely got to be context specific and driven by science and ecosystem function. And I'm sure this last point will generate some debate and discussion. It's not the same as ecological restoration, though of course it's very much part of the same family. We might think about it as a younger, slightly wayward sibling. So all rewilding is restoration, but not all restoration is rewilding. So we might think about restoration as controlled, managed ecosystem recovery. And then rewilding is the kind of controlled decontrolling that comes after that. So enabling nature and ecosystems to become self-willed. And that's perhaps a little bit oversimplistic, but I'm sure we'll pick this issue up when we get to the Q&A session. So Angela's done much of this slide for me already, but as she kind of introduced, the RTG was established in 2017, first as a task force. We were tasked with providing CEM with a clear understanding of rewilding in terms of its history, its definitions, and how this links perhaps to CEM priority areas. And to do this, we talked to a range of rewilding practitioners, scientists, academics, to create with the aim of creating a common basis of rewilding understanding. I think we've gone some way towards that, to achieving that with the guiding principles for rewilding, which Steve is going to introduce later in the session. But for now, what I'm going to do is hand over to Sally, who's going to say a little bit more about rewilding history.
Thanks, Ian. Hi, yes, I'm going to give a very brief introduction to rewilding history before handing over to Steve, who will talk a bit more about the rewilding principles. And this history is based on the results of a survey we ran with rewilding pioneers from around the world. These people have been influential in the rise and evolution of the concept of rewilding. The survey was done in 2018. We approached 126 people, all identified by others as being influential. And 60 people responded to the survey, including key figures from the Wildlands Network and Rewilding Institute in North America, Rewilding Europe, Rewilding Britain and ZSL, along with well-known rewilding academics. The majority of respondents were from North America and Europe, but this corresponds to those areas where the concept of rewilding first arose. The survey contained 25 questions, many of them open-ended questions, where participants were asked to give personal accounts of their experience or understanding of rewilding in the past and how they've changed over time. Next slide. Next slide, Steve. Thanks. So to put rewilding into context, we asked participants to describe the circumstances or drivers which gave rise to the concept. The most prominent of these themes was growing awareness of the extinction crisis and the negative impact of human activities on the natural world, leading to the development of the Anthropocene theory. Related to this was a growing awareness that traditional conservation practices, especially protected areas and single species focused conservation, were ineffective in conserving non-human species and natural systems. A growing awareness of how ecosystems function also led to acknowledgement that these practices should change, that conservation required a more holistic approach that incorporated habitat and ecosystem restoration. Two key theories rarely influence rewilding: the trophic cascade theory and the theory of island biogeography, which highlighted the threat to species in island-like nature reserves, which are surrounded by highly modified anthropogenic landscapes. There's also a mention of a growing interest in reconnecting with nature among the general public, especially where there was a decrease in access to natural areas. Participants in North America also point to an increase in environmental activism, particularly related to the deep ecology movement. In both Europe and North America, increasing rural land abandonment created opportunities for spontaneous rewilding and some encouraging stories of natural recolonization, including of predators, which demonstrated what could happen if humans left areas to nature. Next slide. To show how and when the concept of rewilding spread across the globe, I was able to map the location of each participant against when they first heard of rewilding. So during the 80s and early 90s, these were all based in North America and were part of a group of people who were involved in the founding of the Wildlands Network. These include some key figures like Michael Soule, Reed Noss, and John Davis. Next slide. In the late 1990s, awareness of the concept continued to grow in North America through the Wildlands Network group and publications in their magazine Wild Earth. This includes an article written by Soule and Noss, published in 1998, called Rewilding and Biodiversity, Complementary Goals for Conservation. This seminal paper is seen as giving scientific grounding to the concept of rewilding, providing the ecological argument, emphasizing the restoration and protection of big wilderness and wide-ranging large animals, particularly carnivores. They labeled this the 3 C's of rewilding: cause or protected areas, connectivity between these areas, and carnivores or keystone species. Next slide. Between 2000 and 2005, there were two key events which began to drive awareness of the concept more globally. The Dutch concept of natuurontwikkeling, or nature development, which was being practiced at Oostvaardersplassen by Frans Vera, and the publication in 2005 of Josh Donlan and colleagues' Pleistocene rewilding article in Nature. This paper proposed the idea of using ecological surrogates to restore the ecological roles of Pleistocene era species in North America. So, for example, introducing elephants as surrogates for woolly mammoths. The paper was hotly debated at the time, and because the concept was sensational and published in Nature, which has a global readership, it really drove awareness of the concept of rewilding. And for many years following that, people around the world equated rewilding with this concept of introducing ecological surrogates. Next slide. The remaining participants became aware of the concept between 2006 and 2015. Key events cited here are the founding of Rewilding Europe in 2010, which grew out of the nature development work being done in the Netherlands, and the publication of George Monbiot's book Feral in 2013. Next slide. So based on these influences, different schools of rewilding developed. Despite the evolution of the term elsewhere, the vast majority of North American participants still subscribe very closely to 3 C's rewilding. Along with cause, corridors, and carnivores, they recognize the need to collaborate across disciplines, sectors, and with communities, and to promote more ecocentric values, acknowledging that other species, not just humans, have intrinsic value. Pleistocene rewilding evolved out of the Wildlands Network group, but has had little influence in North America. It's now seen as a thought experiment, but nevertheless had influence in Europe, and especially on islands like Mauritius and Hawaii, where they've introduced tortoise species to replace extinct tortoises. In Europe, there's been the emergence of several groups, but these are less distinct and influence each other, and this includes Rewilding Europe, which evolved out of the work in the Netherlands and has an emphasis on backbreeding and reintroducing de-domesticated herbivores like the aurochs, and also on promoting nature-based economies like ecotourism. Next slide. As you can see, the concept of rewilding can contain a variety of elements dependent on the influences and circumstances. But in terms of the work for the IUCN Rewilding Thematic group, we're interested in looking for the common ground across these understandings of rewilding. And we found these lay in the long-term aims or intentions. The aims we identified include both ecological and social change. The most prominent of these was that rewilding ultimately seeks to promote a world where non-human nature can be self-sustaining or self-regulating and self-willed. So nature that can be itself and look after itself. A necessity for this is the restoration of ecosystems to the point where they can function without human management, which requires complete food webs, as well as a reduction in human control over landscapes, or indeed a reduction in the human desire for control. Rewilding also requires and calls for a shift in the human-nature relationship. At the very least, it requires people to coexist alongside wild nature, which means that people would be able to tolerate the unpredictability or risk that may come with it. So participants also mentioned shifting the human-nature relationship from an anthropocentric one to a bio-ecocentric one, recognizing the intrinsic value of non-human species and processes, but also understanding and valuing interdependencies between and among humans and nature, and valuing nature for its role in sustaining our world. So I'm actually using this data to develop a rewilding framework which incorporates both the ecological and social elements of rewilding using a theory of change model. And I'll be presenting this at the SER conference at the end of June if anybody's interested in hearing more. But with that, I'll hand over to Steve.
Thanks, Sally. So Ian's already mentioned that under rewilding principles, we've got a paper coming out. Well, it's out actually already for open access if you have access to the journal, but the actual proofs and things, open access, are still to come out. So we've already heard from both Ian and Sally this concept of the 3 Cs, cars, corridors, and carnivores, which really came out of that Sewell and Noss paper in 1998. And in developing or trying to develop a more unified approach, we've modified that slightly to come up with this model on the right here, which is really more of a more universally applicable 3 Cs, or new 3 Cs, if you like. So the cores are still there in that, you know, the ecological underpinnings of rewilding in thinking about fully occupied, fully functioning trophic ecosystems. But the corridors were kind of modified into connectivity, and well, the carnivores have gone really, but become more issues about coexistence. And so we've got this diagram, which is more of a 3-circle Venn diagram, which thinks about the overlaps between cores and connectivity, not just ecological connectivity, but with the landscape corridors, but also connectivity between people and nature. And that overlaps nicely with coexistence. So the words in the overlaps here are quite interesting in that, you know, clearly between connectivity and cores, there's issues about ecological principles from ecological migration. The overlap between connectivity and coexistence is really about something about rewilding self, but also this concept of land sharing, which we hear a lot about, as opposed to land sparing, which appears in the third overlap between cause and coexistence, and the role of effective protection. Around the outside, it's interesting that we've kind of labeled, and I know it's not a perfect model, but we've labeled rewilding as being a nature-led, human-enabled concept. So Ian talked a little bit to begin with about how rewilding is the naughty boy at the back of the class in terms of ecological restoration. And we see rewilding as being a flipping ecological restoration on its head a little bit, and things that have been nature-led but human-enabled. So in other words, nature's calling the shots and determining outcomes and trajectories, ecological trajectories. We're just giving it the time and the space to do that. Whereas restoration is a little bit more the other way around, in that it's human-led, but nature-enabled in the concept of using natural processes to achieve desired objectives. And we've simplified that a little bit by taking out some of the extraneous detail in that. So we have a web page, as I say, which is describing the role of the thematic group, and you can download the principles that I'm going to talk about there in full. But I just want to summarize these principles that have come out of this process of the survey work and the literature review and the questionnaire that Sally's talked about. And this is all, as I say, going to be available in this paper in Conservation Biology when it finally does come out. Although, as I say, you can, if you follow that DOI, you can find the earlier version in there, the author-accepted manuscript. So, as part of the drafting of these rewilding guiding principles, or RPGs, we of course had to really pare it back and look at definitions as well. And so the definition that we have here is used to sort of hang these principles off. So the goal of rewilding is the restoration, we would say, of functioning native ecosystems, complete with fully occupied trophic levels that are nature-led. So there's that concept again, across a range of landscape scales. So we're accepting that it can be micro to macro. Rewilded ecosystems should be self-sustaining, and therefore require minimum or non-human intervention management. And so there's the concept of natura naturans, or nature doing what nature does, is important there. And we recognize within this that ecosystems are dynamic and they're not static. So a lot of nature conservation, particularly in Europe and other densely populated parts of the world, is about keeping nature in stasis for what it was originally designated. The rewilding principles should be consistent where appropriate with the evolving principles and standards of ecological restoration, but also nature-based solutions. And of course, CEM have been involved in working on that recently, and the CBD ecosystems approach. Rewilding itself can be described as the process of rebuilding native ecosystems following major human disturbance in order to create a complete food web at all trophic levels as a sustainable and resilient ecosystem, using the biota that would have been present had the disturbance not occurred. So there's kind of a lot of concepts in there which we really think underpin what rewilding is really about. And from that, we've developed a set of principles. But the key points here are that it's about restoration of functioning native ecosystems, fully occupied trophic levels as far as is possible within the scale of the area that's been looked at, species that would have been there had disturbance not occurred, and self-sustaining with minimum no intervention. Accepting that they're dynamic, so succession is a key ecological process along with disturbance, and those should be allowed to take place as ecosystems dictate. There is no simple solution, and so spatially, temporally, and ecologically specific, so context specific within the landscape setting. And of course, I say these are consistent with evolving principles of ecological restoration, NbS, CBD, etc. I'm sure Adam will probably say something about natural capital in a minute. But of course, the science is not by no means clear cut, and so you see a lot of debate in the literature, and these are just a couple of papers which demonstrate that within one of the classic examples of rewilding and trophic cascades, which is still the debate is still going on as to what extent, for example, the regeneration of aspen in Yellowstone is down to the effect of the wolf and predatory pressure on elk populations. So I'm just going to quickly take you through these 10 principles, guiding principles. A little bit of text describing each, but not too much. As I say, in the principles that you find on the RTG website, you'll find a fuller description of these. But the first of which is that rewilding utilizes wildlife to restore trophic interactions. And we start off with the ecological and then move to, in these principles, move on to the more human and scientific aspects in a minute. So this will include reintroduction or population reinforcement of apex predators and other keystone species. The second in the list will be to employ landscape scale planning. And this is where the cores, corridors and carnivores kind of comes in. But as I say, we've remodeled that to core areas, connectivity and coexistence. So your core areas of your protected wild core areas, habitat cores. The connectivity allows for free movement of species, and there should be coexistence of wild species and humans in integrated landscapes. Thirdly, rewilding requires local engagement and support. So it would need to be inclusive with local consultation and participatory planning. We've seen several examples of where rewilding projects have failed because of a lack of engagement with local people. So this we see as being key to success. And this encourages public understanding with wild nature and addresses concerns about that coexistent issue. Number 4 says that rewilding focuses on recovery of ecological processes, the interactions and the conditions of the base reference systems. So again, Ian mentioned this in his discussion of what rewilding isn't, but it isn't about going back, it's about looking forward. But we need to use appropriate ecological references on which to base rewilding decisions. So our contemporary natural references with complete biota are necessary there, or if they're absent, we can base models on historic records, scientific and or indigenous local knowledge. Number 5 says that rewilding recognizes that dynamic and constantly changing of nature and ecosystems. Now, that requires space, and it requires connectivity to allow that temporal change of processes to take place. And we recognize here that there are allogenic or other external forces and drivers, so of disturbance, so for example, storms, floods, wildfire, and of course climate change. And there's a separate principle that focuses purely on climate change in a minute. And also the autogenic, the internal, and there, you know, obviously ecosystems are reliant on nutrient cycles, energy gene flows, etc., for their functioning. And included in that, of course, is predation. So the role of predators in ecosystem function is also key. So as promised, here's 6, which says that we should recognize the impact of climate change. You know, we can't take that out of the equation. So we need to take that into account when planning rewilding projects. And of course, rewilding can be seen as a nature-based solution with aims to mitigate climate change or increase resilience to it by allowing species movements through landscapes in response to climate forcing. 7 says that rewilding is informed by science and indigenous and local knowledge. So this is the more human elements coming in. So practitioner research and indigenous knowledge collaborations will inform rewilding in adaptive management frameworks. 8 says that rewilding recognizes the intrinsic value of all species. So this is a kind of an ethical or moral issue here, in that we have an ethical, as humans, we have a ethical responsibility for the existence of all species. So this is the ecocentric rather than the anthropocentric or that egocentric, as I've sometimes seen it labeled, approach. Rewilding is adaptive and dependent on monitoring and feedback. So this is, you know, it's just basic science, really, I suppose, in terms of this kind of management approach. We use monitoring to provide evidence. We determine the projection trajectories as to whether they're working as planned. We have volunteer-based, participatory, detailed scientific monitoring to check to see if that is true and make changes accordingly with our adaptive management framework. And then finally, some debate as to whether this is actually a principle, but I think it's really important to have at the end here that rewilding does provide us with an opportunity for a paradigm shift in the coexistence of humans and nature. It's really about the awareness of the importance of global ecosystems for all life on the planet. And we need a shift away from these shifting baselines, these shifting ecological baselines towards healthy, fully functioning trophic ecosystems, instead of simply accepting that degraded ecosystems are the norm. And so with that, I'll pass over to Adam, who's going to talk about legal context for rewilding.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everybody. So I'm Adam Eagle. I'm CEO of the Lifescape Project, which is an international rewilding NGO. And my background's as an environmental lawyer with a specific focus on rewilding more recently. And like Steve says, I'm going to briefly talk about the legal context and background to rewilding and legal issues that would likely be relevant to the rewilding practitioner as well. Hopefully I can do that in a way that's actually helpful, which will be at quite a high level. Obviously, because jurisdictions have different laws, and so I'll take a global view as I'm talking through things. So this first slide talks to international law. So international law is a system of treaties, of agreements between nations, and those agreements govern how those nations interact with one another, how they interact with citizens of other nations, with businesses, and how they engage on key issues in an international context. Typically, these sorts of treaties, they're not binding within the signatory countries, so they require that signatory country to enact their own legislation to implement commitments that are in those treaties. But what they do is set a trajectory internationally, and then they influence the steps actually taken on a country by country basis. So obviously they do have a huge impact on the legal and political realities on the ground in any given country. There are a number of treaties that you might say are particularly relevant to rewilding, including the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, the Berne Convention, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Habitats and Birds directives in the EU context. And they all touch on issues that are relevant to rewilding. And they're all particularly, I suppose, helpful from a conservation perspective, a more traditional conservation perspective, as they were really part of the significant movement progressing the need to protect biodiversity within the 20th century. But whilst they do provide, conservation goals, and they have significant value from a conservation perspective, creating usually networks of protected sites and lists of protected species, and none of them actually contain specific targets for restoration of ecosystems or for rewilding. So they're not directly on point, you might say. Something they do, which is closer to being directly on point for rewilding, is that they create the legal structures which are now being used today to facilitate discussions of restoring ecosystems. So the Convention on Biological Diversity, for example, had a 2011 to 2020 strategic plan that specifically targeted restoring biodiversity and ecosystems. And this decade, under the same structure, has been declared as the UN's Decade for Ecosystem Restoration. So clearly, the kind of trajectory, it's towards considering issues that are really relevant to rewilding and to starting to make commitments with regard to that. And one specific example would be the EU, which is currently consulting on and discussing binding restoration targets for nature. So I think for those involved in rewilding, international law is an area to keep an eye on, to lobby in relation to, and to see how it develops. So what I'll do now is, if we move on to the next slide, is I'll just quickly talk about protected sites, because they're intrinsically linked to these treaties that I've just pointed at. Many countries, as a result of the treaties I've pointed at, have specific networks of sites that are designated for nature conservation. Those sites typically will be protected because of particular habitat features or particular species that are present. And they'll also often require specific management approaches to be in place to maintain the sites. So from a conservation perspective, that's been a relatively effective tool in protecting biodiversity, but it can definitely lead to what you might say is an overfocus on single habitats or single features of sites and managing those, rather than taking an ecosystem-wide approach, as Sally and Steve mentioned earlier. So it's definitely possible that sites end up being designated for ecological features which are potentially static, which might be even human influenced and caused, or that levels of management and intervention from humans are being required under these legal regimes, which actually wouldn't permit full ecological function. So that can, in a way, be a barrier to enacting the rewilding principles that Steve has just talked about. And that's a barrier that's essentially, in some ways, erected by the legal systems that are in place for conservation. Obviously, it's also possible that specific governments can take those laws, take those legal systems and structures, and adapt them and use a flexible interpretation of them to allow them to fit rewilding and to fit the principles that Steve has talked about, and full ecosystem functioning and a more landscape scale view. And that's definitely happening in some countries, but it's something that I think we need to see more of if rewilding's to be facilitated from a legal perspective. So if we move on to the next slide, away from protected areas, there's a few other areas of law, broadly speaking, which are relevant to someone that's looking at rewilding as something they might engage in. These areas are, very broadly speaking, land use change, indigenous rights, conservation easements, and species protections, and related species reintroductions. So I'll very quickly, and it is very brief, so I apologize for that, run through those areas. If we move on to the first is land use change. And most jurisdictions, most countries will have bodies of law that relate to how land is used and how that is changing over time, and what's permitted and what's not. So that might be, relating to land ownership, the transfer of land and the ownership of land, the rights of neighbours to a piece of land. It might also be in relation to the laws that are in place regarding what's actually permitted to be done with an area of land. So in many jurisdictions, the planning law system sets out what uses land may be put to and what it may not be put to regarding specific plots and areas. For example, changing land from being used for farming to being rewilded might actually need specific permissions from local or national governments. So it's an area that's definitely relevant to the rewilding practitioner, thinking about what they're going to have to tackle when engaging in a project. Another area under this overall heading of land use change, which is engaged, is the right to roam, which can often be engaged by rewilding endeavours. The right to roam is broadly the right for citizens to access, to walk across, and often to harvest from natural or semi-natural land. And there's definitely circumstances in which some types of rewilding project could inhibit the citizen's ability to access land and use it in that way under the right to roam. So it's another area that can be engaged by entering into a rewilding project. So swiftly moving on to the next slide, which does somewhat follow on from land use change. So it's indigenous rights and local communities' rights, something again that Steve touched on multiple times during his part of the talk. Rewilding projects are implemented on a landscape scale, and they have a significant impact on that landscape and surrounding areas. And often in the past and theoretically, you can see how doing that can impact on local communities and the rights of local peoples. And those rights in some jurisdictions are specifically enshrined in law, in specific legislation. So, whilst it's an ethical issue as well as to how a rewilding project engages with an indigenous people or a local community, it can also be a legal one that needs to be thought of and dealt with in the right way at the outset. So moving on from indigenous rights, we have conservation easements, which are a fairly narrow area, but really potentially very important and a catalyst for rewilding. So a conservation easement, for those that haven't come across this concept before, is a voluntary legal agreement that permanently limits the use of land in order to protect its natural value, its conservation value. So it's an agreement you can enter into to protect land forever if it's, for example, being rewilded. And given the nature of rewilding projects, again, as Steve pointed to, as landscape scale, long-term projects, allowing nature to lead itself, it can take decades and maybe even centuries for ecosystems to recover and come back to full natural functioning. So you can see how it could be very powerful to have a legal mechanism that you can apply to a rewilding project and site, which can protect it and protect that work potentially in perpetuity forever, and allow that ecosystem to get to a stage where it could be fully functioning, even if that's not feasible in the immediate or short term. So a number of countries already have access to these, and a number are starting to legislate for them. So it's definitely an area that's of significant relevance to anyone looking at engaging in rewilding and looking to preserve what they're trying to achieve into the future. And finally, if we move on to this slide, and actually if we skip the species protection slide and go to species reintroductions, these two areas, species protections and all these areas listed under species reintroductions, are certainly engaged when you're looking at restoring an ecosystem and you're looking at replacing specific species which might be absent, might have been removed for anthropogenic reasons, impacts of people in the past. And essentially, you know, the takeaway on this slide is that there are a lot of areas of law that in any given country, someone trying to reintroduce a species, particularly more significant species in terms of apex predators and ecosystem engineers, you're going to have to deal with multiple areas of law and regulation. And I've just listed out a number here. One that's particularly relevant and very obvious is the protection of species under a given country's law. And that can be relevant both because, you know, in order to ensure a rewilding project succeeds, you may need to ensure that your species is protected under your own national law if you're reintroducing it, but also from the perspective of if you're running a reintroduction project that has an exit strategy or that requires you to engage with the species after release, you might, for example, actually require permits to even be able to recapture the species, to collar it, to track it, etc. So I won't go through all these areas because there's lots of them, but hopefully it gives a kind of checklist of areas that are relevant. So I think that's it from me, and we're now handing over to notes from the field, which hopefully will be somewhat less dry than the legal discussion I've just provided. So I think I'll pass on to whoever's next.
Yes, I believe I'm next, Adam. Thank you for that. That was really interesting. My name is Erwin van Maanen. I'm a conservation biologist by training and through various international projects. And central to many of my projects is actually the wolf as an apex predator. And this predator also brought me into contact with the exciting field of rewilding, including also being inspired by the late Professor Michael Soleil, who was my friend and also my mentor. And he also used the wolf as an important inspirator for his rewilding vision ideas together with his fellow biologists, including Reed Noss. So since about a millennium, I became fascinated by this subject of rewilding. And as an advocate, I worked for, we had a rewilding foundation, and we propagated the idea of rewilding as broadly as we could. Not well known internationally, but we've done some really nice projects, including some very dangerous or exciting regions like Iran, for example, but also going into the rainforests of Bolivia, etc. And of late, I've gone closer to home because my great inspirator in rewilding, the wolf, has actually landed quite close to my home, actually about 24 kilometers away from here, in an area called Veluwe. But I've been following this return of the wolf from Eastern Europe towards the North Sea since around 2008 or so. And I've been very grateful to be able to study the species of late. So I want to illustrate with some field work the case of spontaneous rewilding, whilst many of us are still discoursing about rewilding and what it should be or what it's not, or whether it's restoration or not. The wolf is actually one of those species that is guiding us or pointing us to what rewilding could be. So it's going past us, already showing us what rewilding is. And in the area which I'm studying the wolf, which is Lower Saxony in Germany, is also a very interesting area to demonstrate rewilding because there are a lot of land use processes which are changing there, including the so-called land flights or depopulation of areas influenced by certain waning of activities and also the growth of great ungulate populations, so that the prey base of the wolf is very great there in many parts of Germany. And that's also partly, for example, caused by climate change and land use change. So these are in a way negative, but also positive factors that result in the return of the wolf. So may I have the next slide, please? And I may illustrate this continuum model on rewilding, in which we can also place the wolf. So if we talk about rewilding, we can talk about it on different scales, which may be on a very small local scale, for instance, within a park area in a city, for example, when we talk about restoring insect communities, for example. We can do great wonders almost if we say rewild a patch with wildflowers, and it's just amazing to see what happens with insect communities within a short period of time. That's rewilding on a small scale. But we can also talk about pristine wilderness areas, remote areas where there's still complete communities of organisms. And that's, of course, is one of the great aims of rewilding, to restore these more whole communities of animals, because a lot of these trophic relationships have become truncated in a way. But we're also looking at our own, say, Western world, where a lot of the landscape is man-made or man-modified. There's also many opportunities and also many signs of these natural emergence processes, ecological processes, which we also call natura naturans, nature, what nature does. And the wolf is also part of the nature. It does what it wants to do. So the wolf has been trying to return from east to west for a long, long time, actually, since it was eradicated in the early 20th century. It has come back from behind the Iron Curtain when it was pulled down. And these wolves have come back in a spectacular way. May I have the next slide, please? So in these kinds of landscapes, which actually have these natural features, but also are very man-made. As an example from an area in Germany with a military practice site, which is combined with hunting, forestry, but also with intensive agriculture. And this is one of those places where the wolf has returned and is actually thriving. May I have the next slide? And in some respects, it's also wilderness, because some of these areas are increasingly, especially in this part of Germany, extensively used. So a lot of other species are returning as well. For instance, the crane, the beaver, the otter, all these species that were eradicated for a long time or suffered from intensive land use practice. The next slide. And they're also still man-utilized in many ways. So there are areas where there's some form of industrialization, like in this peat area in Western Germany, which is a very large area with a lot of still natural peat or restored peat, but also being excavated for peat. And this is one of the areas where the wolves are actually moving behind the piles of peat while the workers are working there. So it also demonstrates that wild animals can return to places and live quite close to human beings. So human beings don't have to be excluded. Next, please. So this is the region where the wolf came back, and it's quite a spectacular development. The next slide. Next slide, please. And I've been able to actually establish where the wolves are living and how they live there, because I like to learn how they coexist with humans in this landscape, and also how they interact with the landscape. So how they can be regarded as a rewilding factor and show us what rewilding is all about. And here you see some examples in the central part or core area of a wolf and how they live, including the reproduction of wolves. Next slide. So here you see the spectacular development of wolves over the last 20 years or so. The wolf has come back from the eastern part of Germany, from Poland, in an area called Lausitz, and has since then established itself westwards all the way to the Netherlands nowadays, and is spreading over the landscape. Next slide. And in part also because the ecological conditions are quite perfect for the wolf there. There's a lot of prey available, because the German policy is to manage the landscape with a lot of wild animals or hunting species, like the wild boar, 2 species of deer, and roe deer also. And this has been quite positive for the wolf, because in many areas of Europe the prey base was depleted, and the wolf actually needs this food base to establish itself durably. So this can also be regarded as a very open system. If you compare that, for example, to the Oostvaardersplassen, which is a rewilding experiment in the Netherlands, a very confined area with a high density of ungulates, but without any carnivore. And you see there the effects of overgrazing, for example, which is caused by this high density of herbivores, and also a high level of management or intervention management that's needed to maintain that. Whereas in Germany, it's an open system, an OVP on a very large scale, where wolves and its prey animals can interact quite openly. And it's very interesting to study that in terms of the rewilding effects. Next, please. Yes, next slide. Just showing here the different wild or high density of animals in the German landscape. Next, please. Yes, next. So with the return of the wolf, also it's as an apex predator, its top-down regulatory function also came back. And this is what I'm studying at present. What the effects on the landscape and also the animal communities are, also to study the ideas from North America, like the landscape of fear idea. In what way does the wolf disproportionately exert effects on animal communities? And it's quite interesting and very difficult to study in a man-made landscape, because we lack the dynamics that are in Yellowstone National Park, for example. But nevertheless, from what I studied so far, I'm seeing effects on, for example, certain behavior of ungulates, but also smaller carnivores, the mesocarnivores, in the presence of wolves. So you see this effect on the landscape and also a diversification of the biodiversity in a way happening even in areas which are highly managed by humans. Next. Next, please. Essentially, also the 3C model, the original model for rewilding that was proposed by Reed Noss and Michael Soleil and others, Dave Foreman also. And you see that this is quite important for the establishment of large carnivore populations like the wolf, which are wide-ranging. They need a lot of space and they need a lot of prey base. And what you see in the German landscape, and especially in Lower Saxony, is that these wolves do occupy core areas which are least human influenced. Even the most least human influenced places in these core areas, they seek out, and that's where you will find them. They also need a lot of wide area to roam safely without too many busy roads, for example, but also disturbance pressure from humans to do their hunting effectively. And I need space to establish other areas. And this is the process that's currently occurring in Europe, where the wolves are dispersing and seeking new areas, for example, in the Netherlands, but they have a very hard time, for example, the Netherlands, which is very densely populated, to find these places. So that also demonstrates at the same time that to establish durable large carnivore populations, you need this space, you need more natural quality on large areas, and more restoration of animal communities, which the wolf is actually helping to do as well once it can establish itself. So in this sense, that's also the naturans idea in effect going into effect. Next, please. So this is really an exciting development with the return of the wolf, but at the same time, there's a lot of resentment growing against the wolf, that the wolf in certain quarters is not welcome, that it shouldn't be in the landscape. So there's a lot of task there also to change people's minds about the important role of animals like the wolf. So the rewilding of minds comes into play here. And I think that's quite a challenge, because also in some areas in Europe, there needs to be an active approach to bringing back carnivores, like, for example, bringing back the lynx in the United Kingdom. is meeting a lot of resistance, whereas the wolf as a spontaneous emergent property in Europe has received a lot of acceptance, but at the same time, there's a lot of resistance also growing against the wolves. And I've also seen that interaction into the field, because some of my wolves that I've been studying are currently being shot in Western Germany. So in effect, we haven't learned yet. And there's still a lot of work to do to effectuate rewilding in policy, and also the importance amongst a large group of people. Next, please. The next one. Yes. So there's a lot of debate about animals like the wolves, which in effect is also a debate about rewilding. And we should learn also ways to harmoniously live together with these keystone animals and learn their importance, so that we don't fall back into the trap of eradicating them like in the past, and creating the status quo where nature is kind of not fully developed as it is in many states now, and with a lot of rewilding still going on around the world. Yes, please. Next one. Yeah, one back. So at the end, also there's still a lot to learn about founding the rewilding science, including the idea of the role of large predators and their effects on animal communities. But from my work, I've learned that the wolf does have an important key role to play, even if it is on the regulation level of herbivores, and at the same time also through primary production, creating a lot more diversity, for example, in plant communities. And I think we can still learn a lot about how to incorporate these wild elements in more man-modified landscapes, and that it's not all about creating perfect wildernesses, but more about creating more harmonious relationships and acceptance of wildness in our own area, so to speak. So thank you very much.
Steve, I guess it's my turn. Zoltan Kun speaking. So if you could go back to the first slides of the notes. Yes. Basically what I will try to speak and try to elaborate here today, and I hope you hear me. If not, text me or something like that, is to encourage the participants to contribute to our work, because basically what we thought within the task force or thematic working group, that the IUCN issue brief, which Ian mentioned earlier, needs to be supported by and the rewilding principles as well needs to be supported by case studies. So we developed a template, very simple case study template that can collect a max 2-page long case study examples. The Society for Ecological Restoration that project database looks as a very interesting source of information, but it would be really good and key to be in touch directly with those who have the field information. Next slide, please. So I will present one example from Poland, which is a forest-related rewilding coming from Drava National Park. And again, this is based on the local knowledge. Paweł Pawlacik from the Naturalist Club from Poland helped me to write that case study. And it is based on the abstract of his intervention in a conference in the Tatra National Park in 2018. So again, please feel being encouraged that you contact us later, and we can send you the template and you can send us your rewilding example. Next slide, please. This is simply just to demonstrate the structure of the case study and to tell you present one example. This is again a forest area, but we would not limit the case studies only to forest habitats, obviously. The Drava National Park in Poland, which used to have quite a lot of traditional forest land use, logging in other words, The local economy changed, so there was a gradual decrease of logging pressure on the land. The national park was created, and there has already been some core area within the national park which were managed according to non-intervention principles with passive rewilding. So basically, this was, the next slide, please. This example is based on, as you can see on the first slide or first picture from '98, the original core area. First, a strategic plan, how this could be enlarged, how the existing core areas could be enlarged, and how, as you can see in the slides or in the pictures, could be connected as well. So it demonstrates the core connectivity principle from the rewilding principles. Interestingly, we also, or the local people also needed to convince basically the conservationists that this is a good approach. Yeah, we are still kind of far away from having the whole area, whole national park under non-intervention management, because the total territory is around 10,000 hectares, but roughly, let's say 40–50% of it would fall under the left free from human intervention zone. Next slide, please. So the action basically was that planning and create or enlarge the core area. The result was there was significant improvement of the structure of the forest ecosystem due to the natural processes. There were passively conserved bogs, and the poor fens retained their natural values. So the hydrological restoration also happened at the same time. Interestingly, the faunistic values especially correlated with the lower level of human activity. So the non-intervention management actually worked or seemed to work in terms of increasing the forest-related biodiversity or ecosystem richness, so to say. The impression of the naturalness, and in a way that I saw that there was a question from Robert regarding what sort of financing could go to rewilding. I mean, tourism is one, but obviously, as I answered Robert in the Q&A, I think we need to utilize more the payment for ecosystem services opportunities. This is still, we talk more about this than practice it actually, but now the new multi-annual financial framework in the European Union and also the next generation EU fund, or let's call it recovery and resilience facility, could help to get more funding for passive restoration, actually to have non-intervention and to enlarge core areas. That would also help to get financial incentive to private landowners. But in this case, in the Drava, the naturalness of wildness became a kind of magnet for tourists as well to visit the area. Next slide, please. I think that will be the last one for yes, the lessons learned section. So again, the template consists of 4 major elements. What was the problem? What rewilding action was taken? What was the result? And what are the lessons learned? Here is the lessons learned. Non-intervention is not only an appropriate tool for managing the existing natural forest, but also a tool for forest restoration. This is quite critical finding in the sense of the decade of ecosystem restoration, which I think Adam mentioned in his legal presentation. So this decade is now ongoing. So we have quite a big opportunity for rewilding. And I would like to remind you that in the Global Biodiversity Outlook 3rd document, which was published in 2010, rewilding has already been mentioned there as a quite big opportunity in Europe. They said 200,000 square kilometers could be used for rewilding in Europe. That's quite an exceptional large area. Now we have the decade on ecosystem restoration, and the EU is actually working on restoration, a binding restoration law and binding restoration target, so we can use rewilding again for what Steve said, core connectivity and coexistence. And the rest, yeah, I mean, you can read what were lessons learned. I wouldn't read it up. I think the next slide is already the next presentation, but Steve, Could you get to the next one? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention, and the next speaker is going to come now.
Hello, I'm Rene Beyers. I'm a researcher at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, and I will present some examples from North America. So I'll talk a bit about the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative, which is one of the most famous examples in North America and even beyond of rewilding. And as Erwin, I will also say a few things about wolves because they've been so important in the whole rewilding movement both in Europe and North America. And finally, just a word about the Wildways, the Wildlands Network, which was a organization which was foundational in the development of the concept of rewilding. So first, let's go a little bit to Yellowstone. I think many of you may know this example where wolves were reintroduced after being absent for a very long time. The absence of wolves in the last century in Yellowstone led to overbrowsing of aspen and willow and cottonwood by elk and deer. And then the idea was to reintroduce wolves to restore the ecosystem or the ecosystem interactions and ecosystem function. After the reintroduction, and this is a simplified diagram, but after the reintroduction of wolves, elk populations declined, but were also being scared away by the wolves. I think Erwin talked about this, the landscape of fear, especially near rivers and streams. And this, because there were fewer elk, there was less browsing, and this led to a recovery of the willows and aspen near the streams, which then stabilized the stream banks and also led to an increase in beaver populations and songbirds that benefited from the restored habitat and from the ponds that beavers created. Next slide. Yellowstone is in the most southern portion of the Yellowstone to Yukon area, which goes along the Rocky Mountains all the way to the Yukon in Canada. And the initiative goes back to 1993, where Harvey Locke, a Canadian lawyer, came up with the idea of developing a Yellowstone to Yukon biodiversity strategy. This was then endorsed by Wildlands Network and the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. I'm going to be very brief about this because this is a really big initiative, but basically it is a conservation network. They collaborate with more than 450 different groups, both private and public, and also individual scientists. The Y2Y is also home to over 75 First Nations groups that have their traditional territories in the landscape. The Y2Y does a lot of different things, promote the idea of the Yellowstone to Yukon landscape, connected landscape, communication. There's a lot of education awareness. They use science to set priorities for connectivity and restoration. Y2Y has also provided funding for many different projects that have been carried out by them or their partners, and a lot of policy work as well. Next slide, please. So the Y2Y area is, and I hope I don't know if I said what Y2Y was, but it's Yellowstone to Yukon. The Y2Y area is enormous. It spans around 3,200 kilometers, has a total area of 1.5 square kilometers, and it contains within its boundaries some of the most pristine landscapes that are still left in the world. The map that you see shows you the number of species across the continent and the change in that from historic populations to current populations. And the decline in number of species has been quite dramatic, despite the fact that, you know, North America is still a bit more wild, so to say, as Europe. Also, even within the Y2Y area, species have declined. The goal of Y2Y now is to restore these populations of big mammals and other animals through the protection of core habitat and restoring connectivity. Much of Y2Y has focused on big carnivores like grizzly bears, but there's also work being done on other species such as woodland caribou, for example, an endangered species that I talk a little bit more about later. Next slide, please. So if you look at some of the impacts that Y2Y had, then we see that there has been a substantial increase in protected lands or conservation lands since the conception of the initiative. There's different focus in different areas. In the north, it is more about protecting what is still left, because there's a lot of big wilderness still left, especially in Yukon and northern BC. In the middle, it's more about connecting core habitats to facilitate movement of big mammals between these habitats. And in the south, there's a lot of emphasis also on restoration of habitat and restoring connectivity between core areas. Next slide, please. Some of the outcomes out of many are shown on this slide. Y2Y has focused and followed the North American tradition of the 3 Cs, core habitat, corridors, and carnivores. In terms of core habitat, there has been a substantial increase in protected areas of about 15% or so. In terms, and some of the areas that have been protected now are very big. In terms of corridors, a lot has been done around safe passage of roads. A total of 616 over and underpasses have been constructed to facilitate animal movement. There have been 50 projects or so to support coexistence with bears and other carnivores. On the restoration side, in some areas, roads were decommissioned, streams improved, invasive plants removed, native vegetation restored, etc. And in terms of funding, for example, Y2Y helped raise $45 million for projects and partners over the years. Next slide, please. A little bit about wolves. As Erwin has shown, this is a very important apex keystone species, both in Europe and in North America and elsewhere as well. But the story is often complicated with wolves, especially in human managed landscapes, as you've seen before. For example, here in the Y2Y landscape and beyond, the wolves play a crucial role, but it is complicated because of logging in the area. Moose benefited from the vegetation that springs up after log or in logged over areas, and colonized areas that where they were not existing before. The increase in the moose population has also attracted the wolves and led to an increase in wolves population, the wolf population. Now, wolves, they prey both on moose and woodland caribou, but woodland caribou, which occurs in much smaller numbers, is a secondary species or secondary prey for them. But because of the increase in wolves, thanks to the moose, they continued to prey on woodland caribou, and woodland caribou populations have plummeted and have gone extinct in many places. So what can we do now about this in terms of rewilding? ultimately, the habitat has to be restored and forest has to grow back, but that obviously takes a very long time. So in the meantime, several measures are being taken. One is to kill the wolves to protect the caribou, but this is very controversial. Another one is to kill more moose, is to actually increase the hunting of moose, thereby leading to a reduction of the population in wolves. This has been quite successful in some places and not so much in others. And then a third option, which is also being done, is to protect woodland, especially calving woodland caribou from wolves by putting them in the mothers and their babies then in birthing pens. One project, for example, that is doing this is in northern BC, and this is led by First Nations, and they're also restoring the habitat. Next slide, please. So wolves are complicated, and of course another complication with wolves is the coexistence with humans. There exist several projects in the United States and in Canada as well that work on this coexistence and develop methods to protect livestock from wolves. I'm not going into any detail because we're running out of time a bit. On the wolves are also a very big political issue. Just to illustrate this, in Colorado, the elections in November 2020, people voted for the reintroduction of wolves to deal with overbrowsing by elk and restore ecosystems in the state. But then in the state of Idaho in May this month, a bill was put into effect that removes a limit on hunting of wolves, which is actually opening the door for the elimination of wolves of most of the state. Next slide, please. Just one, very brief about the Wildlands Network. It is another initiative based in the States. It is actually the organization that Michael Soule, Reed Knowles, and Jim Estes founded in 1991. They focus on wildways, Pacific, Western, Eastern, trying to connect, core habitat in these areas and facilitate movement of animals. And as with Y2Y, they work with many different partners. I think I'll have to leave it by this, but thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Can you go on to the next slide? So we are running out of time. So to try to give as much time as possible for questions and discussion, I guess my take certainly on the message coming through from the case studies is that what we need is a new relationship, a paradigm shift in our relationship with the natural world. And how do we move from egocentric to ecocentric? How do we move from an anthropocentric worldview to one which is biocentric or ecocentric? We think that rewilding is absolutely part of this solution. And in terms of the next steps for our work, we're about to start working on some rewilding guidelines, which will be based on the platform that we've created with the rewilding principles. We've presented some rewilding case studies today, but of course we are fully aware that we need to take a much more global perspective on that. We didn't get time to talk to you about some really interesting work in South America, for example, with rewilding and the Tompkins conservation. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us in terms of how we progress rewilding. Steve, do you want to say anything else in terms of the summary?
I think we'll open it up for discussion there, Ian, but within the guidelines, just to say that, yes, we're very much aware that we need to take a global perspective. We need to incorporate elements of best practice in there. And there's been a whole series of associated issues and concepts that we're dealing with here. which kind of overlap the rewilding sphere. And there's all of these complex social, political, and economic aspects, not just the ecology. All of the case studies do inform us of that. So yeah, I think we'll open it up.
Yeah, and I guess just to very quickly add to that, we're very cognizant as well of related concepts like nature-based solutions, natural capital, ecosystem goods and services, which will become part of that discussion that we have about progressing the guidelines. So if I was monitoring the chat as we went through, so there's a few kind of points that have been made that are probably worth picking up. A question I think for you, Adam, from Jean-Paul, which is quite a techie question, but do easements typically have financial incentives in terms of reduction in taxes?
So the quick answer is sometimes or often, I think. So it depends on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. So country by country, some countries have put in place specific laws that provide a specific tax break, which is obviously a very good, useful incentive to encourage people to enter into conservation easements. Other countries haven't got anything at all. And some countries don't have anything built into the legislation, but it could be arguable under their existing tax schemes, laws and exemptions that there could be exemptions anyway. So there's not a consistent answer. It depends on the country.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Question of, I would have kind of rolled together a question from Robert and from Brian, which are really focusing on local engagement with rewilding, and how do we engage with local communities? How do we perhaps work with them so that rewilding is seen more positively? I think Brian mentioned this idea of a kind of PR problem perhaps with rewilding that's seen as being, well, as I said at the start of the talk, perhaps fundamentalist at times. So I don't know who would like to respond to that question. How do we work more meaningfully with local communities?
Don't mind jumping in. I think the more that we start to understand the benefits of rewilding, and that they're not just economic, a lot more work needs to be done, basically. But I think it will become more appropriate or more desirable for communities to start to focus and actually start to drive their own rewilding projects. Yeah, and anybody else?
Yeah, maybe I think important is to involve local communities at the start, right at the start of any rewilding project or even conservation project, even in the conceptual phases, because if they feel they have ownership in the project, they're a lot more motivated to participate.
I think there's also, and there is an economic angle as well, and there's also an angle of changing the longer term narrative away from solely productivity with regards to rural land use, and building a new narrative that's mixed and not just focused on that, which obviously has been happening for many years with various types of subsidy, but continuing that trajectory and placing more and more emphasis on functioning ecosystems.
I mean, I think a good example is Tompkins Conservation and some of their work in Patagonia with local communities and how they've been able to create economic opportunities, mainly through ecotourism, but in a way which was able to kind of shift the narrative towards the rewilding being seen much more positively. Sorry, Steve, I think you were about to say something there as well.
Well, I was just going to mention the fact that there's interesting developments in the rewilding sphere in the north of Scotland at the moment, in that a lot of those landscapes of classic sort of landscape abandonment, some of it forced, some of it economic migration out of the landscape. But there are movements afoot in that landscape for a repeopling as well as a sort of a rewilding to go hand in hand. And that sounds potentially counterintuitive, but I think it's about people realizing the economic and social and ecological benefits of being on the edge of core wild areas, and the economies, the alternative economies that can build up around that, which aren't just about extractive land use. And if you know anything about the north of Scotland, it is a ecologically depauperated landscape for various reasons. So there's a great potential there, I think, what Ian said at the beginning. Rewilding isn't anti-farming, it isn't anti-people. There are opportunities to go hand in hand, but we mustn't lose sight of the ecological underpinnings at the end of the day. Otherwise, you're chucking the baby out with the bathwater, to coin a phrase. Sorry if that's a UK-centric saying, but you get the drift.
Okay, cheers. There's a comment from Cara Nelson right at the start, and I think we were talking about the relationship between restoration and rewilding, and we made the point that maybe a key driver for rewilding is to move towards our self-sustaining system, self-willed land. And Cara makes the point that restoration also aims for self-sustaining systems. So would anybody like to comment on that?
For me, rewilding, what's integral to rewilding is actually that cultural change that I don't know how much it's actually incorporated into ecological restoration, but it doesn't always come across in rewilding literature, or even existing rewilding frameworks really focus on the ecological side. But in terms of the aims of rewilding, that shift from an anthropocentric to an ecocentric culture is really key. And the aims are actually, when I was looking at the survey results, people really talked about the benefits of rewilding in terms of well-being for humans and societal well-being, not just health, but financial reward in terms of that could come about from living in a more a better way, hand in hand with nature.
Thanks, Sally. Question from Hasib. Rewilding is not for land scarce poorer countries with huge populations and a continuous drive for agriculture and economic development. So can rewilding work in those kinds of contexts? Anybody like to respond to that?
Well, I think that the one thing that comes to mind goes back to ecosystem services and natural capital, and countries in that sort of position might be in a better position to take into account the value of nature and ecosystem services that it's providing to them at a much earlier stage than more developed countries did so. So we're looking, for example, in the UK now, there's a huge emphasis on looking at ecosystem services, looking at paying people to maintain them or to improve those for the wider benefit of society. But I mean, taking out the land scarce bit, which I think makes the question much more difficult. If land wasn't scarce in the sense that it was a larger country with a larger land area, then it might still be possible to incentivize people maintaining ecosystems and those services that come with them and benefit communities as well. If it's also land scarce in the sense of being very small and not having much natural or semi-natural land remaining, I can see it, obviously that's quite problematic.
Thanks, Adam. Maybe time for one more question. And I guess at the start of the talk, I said rewilding isn't just about wolves, and we spent quite a lot of time talking about wolves. So inevitably, there's a question about this, and it's from Deepu, and he says, well, I'm paraphrasing, but how do we live harmoniously with the wolf? I guess that's probably Erwin, Zoltan, or Rene to respond to that, or all three of you, if you like.
Well, maybe I can answer first. I think, well, the wolf led the way, I must say, but of course, rewilding is much broader and on different scales, as I try to illustrate with the rewilding continuum. But still, the wolf is a test case for us for rewilding our minds, because it is on our doorstep. It does intrude into our neighborhood, so to speak. And it's showing us that rewilding is there and it's alive, and that we should learn from it. So in that sense, we should learn from the wolf. And at the same time, it's also a kind of way for a lot of people to learn what nature is about, thinking about the wolf, what it needs in terms of ecology, but also in the relationship with us and wolves, and why we could tolerate it, because it's not a dangerous animal, as it is in a lot of minds of people. But we should all learn with respect to the wolf that nature is part of us and that we should steward it properly.
There's actually evidence, or there's been research that shows that where people coexist with wolves, it actually increases tolerance for apex predators and the ability to coexist. So it's like almost a cycle there, a virtuous cycle.
Yeah, I would.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead,
No,
Rene.
fine. No, I just wanted to add that there are successful projects of coexisting with wolves, and as Erwin said, there's a lot of ignorance that has to be overcome. But for example, the one I just mentioned on the slide in Idaho is they managed to reduce the predation on livestock, especially sheep, very substantially by monitoring wolf packs where they are and alerting farmers when they're close to their livestock, by special kinds of fencing, guard dogs, and things like that. So there are techniques to deal with limiting damage by wolves, and it's also, as Erwin said, much of a change in attitude.
Okay, thanks. We're about to be out of time, I think. So just to finish there, I think I'd like to say thank you to everyone for participating this afternoon. It's been great to have you as part of the audience, and really interesting questions coming through. We haven't had time to pick up all the questions, but we can try to do that afterwards. Thanks to all the panelists, and of course, thank you to Angela for enabling us to run this session this afternoon. So yeah, cheers everyone. See you soon, hopefully.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.